morning and welcome. And it's a great pleasure to be here with this wonderful, wonderful panelist. I just woke up and they told me, oh, you're doing this. And I said, well, I'm in safe hands because Kinna is here, Mukoma is here, Safiya is here. So I'll just let them talk, okay? And they say we're going to be talking about whether African literature matters. So it's a simple and straightforward thing, I promise. Okay, but before we go into the nitty-gritty of that, which is not nitty-gritty at all, yeah, I'll just read a brief citation of our distinguished panelists. I'm going to start with this wonderful, wonderful person right next to me, Kinna Likimani, who is the director at Odekro, right? Yeah, a parliamentary monitoring organization based in Ghana. She's also the founder of Nsona Books, which publishes fiction by emerging writers in Ghana. Amen to that. You know, we keep asking for newer voices from the continent, and they write and they don't have publishers. So it's amazing that she's doing that. Well done for doing it. Akwaba. Her literary blog, Kinna Reads, is one of the go-to locations online for dialogue on African literature. In 2012, she began an online-based literacy challenge, the Africa Reading Challenge, which encourages participants to read, discover, and discuss African literature for one whole year. She has degrees from Smith College and Columbia University in the US. Prior to her returning to Ghana in 2004, she worked for 10 years at Columbia University in the field of medical informatics and technology. She's going to tell us what that is. And she and her brood of boys live in Accra, Ghana, where they always eat Ghanaian jollof rice. And right next to Kinna is the wonderful, wonderful Mukoma wa Ngugi, who is an associate professor of English at Cornell University and author of The Rise of the African Novel, which entirely qualifies him to answer the question we're going to ask today. And he also authored 3 books, Mrs. Shaw, Black Star Nairobi, and Nairobi Heat, which you all must read. And his new novel, We Sing the Tizita to Unbury Our Dead. Wonderful title. Wonderful title. It's going to be coming out very, very soon, and his works have been translated into German, Turkish, and French. He's a member of the African Literature Association's Executive Council. Sounds grand, doesn't it? We'll see. We'll find out. We'll find out. And he's the co-founder of the Mabati Cornell Kiswahili Prize for African Literature. And I'm wondering why he's not doing one in Hausa, for God's sake, seriously. He holds a PhD in English from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the son of the world-renowned African writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He had to put that in to rub it in, right? That's so unfair. It's so unfair. And finally, we have Safiya Ismaila Yero, who is from Adamawa State, Nigeria. She obtained a BA and an MA in English and Literature from the University of Abuja. All these posh Abuja people. She obtained a postgraduate diploma in education from the Nigerian Teachers Institute. She taught in a secondary school before joining the University of Abuja, where she currently works. Her debut novel, When There Is Life, was published by Almaz Books in 2013. She's currently working on her PhD in literature dissertation entitled Emergent Trends in Contemporary Northern Nigerian Fiction. Safiya is also a poet, book reviewer, and editor. She is married and blessed with 2 children. All these married people. Okay, so these are my panelists, and I'm just going to ask them the question. Does African literature matter?
Yeah, so does African literature matter? Yes, it does. You know, and you only need to look at the at decolonization, right? You only have to look at the what I call the Makerere generation. You know, that's the Shoinka, Goge, you know, Achebe, and so on and so forth, and the role literature has played in decolonization. in two ways. One, giving us a Pan-African identity, right? I can come to Nigeria and strike a conversation with anybody about either things fall apart or the river between and so on and so forth. And then they themselves were actively involved through literature, but also as human beings in decolonization, right? They were anti-neo-colonial. And you can tell it mattered because of how the African governments responded to them, right? Either jailing them, killing some of them like Kensarawiwa, and so on and so forth. But we have to think of African literature as a contradiction, right? On the one hand, you have it helps with decolonization. On the other hand, it also cements the English metaphysical empire, right? So you can see the contradiction. For example, Eskia Mfalele arguing that we should be writing in English because it's the language of decolonization, without any sense of irony or contradiction. So we look at it as a contradiction. At the same time, the Makerere generation was mostly masculine, right? It was mostly a masculine affair, until people like Amata Idu, and maybe you'll tell us more about that, intervened and lamented how they were not getting critical attention. But let me stop there, and then we can continue on.
I hate the question. I loathe the title for the very reason, and that's why I wanted Mukoma to go first, because I knew he was going to repeat. The very reason why we shouldn't be asking this question is that we can't continue to treat African literature as some emerging art form. So why are we asking this question in 2018 when our ancestors and our forebears have laid the groundwork, even going beyond post-colonial literature to our oral literatures? If we ask the question, does African literature matter, we are literally asking whether we matter. People are their art form, and art form is their people. So I'm not going to say, yeah, I just can't deal. I would like us to move on from always treating our literatures like emerging.
Yeah.
And talk about the different, price. There are issues to discuss, but not whether we matter, whether it matters. I mean.
Safiya Yero.
Well, I think the founders of African literature, or the people that started writing, have addressed this issue. Because it mattered that they started writing. It was because it mattered then, and it still matters, and it will always matter, that Achebe wrote to deconstruct what writers like Joseph Conrad and Joyce Carey wrote about in Heart of Darkness and Mr. Johnson. It was because he wants to write to tell us and to tell the world that Africa is not that very miserable long night of savagery that those writers portray. That was why he started writing. And that was the reason why in 1975, the African Literature Association was set up in Texas. So it has always mattered. That was why these people came together, and it still matters. And that is why we are all here, because it matters. If it doesn't, we wouldn't be sitting here. If it doesn't, we wouldn't be writing. So I think I have addressed that.
Okay.
Yeah, can I add something? So what I find most painful when it comes to African literature is what we have allowed it to become, right? Where we have allowed it to become a myth, where we begin the African literary historical clock with the Makerere generation, right? Starting from the late 1950s. But there's a lot of hidden history that we don't usually look at. We don't look at early South African writing in African languages, for example. And this is a very, very important literature because it was the literature that began, you could argue, South African decolonization, right? Most of those writers were anti-apartheid. For example, in Nkoleli, the song we all know was composed by that generation of early South African writers, right? So we don't talk about that. We don't talk about Amharic literature. And this is a literature that begins in the 1200s. We don't talk about Afro-Arab literature that will begin in the 500s. right? So there is all this literature that we don't talk about. So that's one. The other thing we don't do is we don't look at what, for example, African American literature as part of African literature. Why can't we look at early slave narratives as part of African literature, right? The memory is directly from Africa, right? So what, for me, I would say my main concern is what we ignore, or is the fact that we have allowed ourselves to accept this myth that African literature begins with things fall apart and ends with a ditchy, right? And I like to make the joke, if we say from Achebe to Adichie, we're only moving from A to A.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just going to ask, because following on the conversation that has been generated already, early African writing has been, preoccupied with justifying the African's right to be called human, or to be viewed as human, or to kind of explain Africanness, or what it means to be African, or to explain Africa as a whole, or to explain that we had a civilization before the coming of the white men, right? Do you think that this has imposed some kind of expectation on subsequent generation of African writers? This need to explain your humanity, your being human, your being African, what it means to be a black African or a white African or whatever it is?
Again, I think this is something that, I don't know, but we saddle African literature with. In other words, going back to Mukoma's point about generalizing and making African literature start at that point, then it seems like we want to then victimize, maybe it's not the right word, or superimpose that on all African literatures. We are the only one, again, who does this to each other. So if we started in a certain way, and let's, for the sake of this, my point, say we started at post-colonial or that point, that doesn't mean that we have to be always there or always question why we are doing that. We are the only ones who are, we are the only ones. It's like someone sent out a tweet that, I think it was bristle paper. Something about African writers always writing about heavy themes and, something about micro whatever. But I love Eastern European literature. I mean, when I reach for translated fiction, most likely it's what I go for, Croatia, Russia, Hungary. And they are doing this all the time, are they not? If you read 70s, 80s, Czech literature, or they were under repression, so they wrote about it. Nobody ever says, do you feel the need to continue that or whatever? So again, it's like this thing where, and I hate to answer those questions about themes, because again, we victimize I don't understand it. Everybody writes what they want to write, and we are the only ones who say, Africans write about big themes. Why don't they write about small things? And I say, we've been writing about small things in big things. We've been writing about ourselves. If we are people at a certain crossroads or under pressure from external forces or political forces, we can only really write about that. Otherwise, are we there or not? I mean, so again, look.
I wanted to add something before I answer that question, and this is a question I'm addressing to writers here, right? To think about what it means for your imagination to start from the wrong literary period, right? What does it mean that our imaginations is not in touch with all these other, literary histories, right? So it's as if we are writing with one arm behind our backs, and we really need to think about that and bring this early African writing as part of look at it, think about intertextuality, right? If you look at every book written today by the young African writers, the references to things fall apart or the river between and so on and so forth. So what does it mean that your imagination is sort of, is not in touch with its own history, right? But to answer the question at hand, yes, you can look at African literature and how it has changed over time, right? With early South African literature, I argue in my novel, in my book, The Rise of the African Novel, that it was a literature of synthesis. That is, it was dealing with an apartheid not yet fully formed, right? So to put it simply, it was arguing that there's a possibility of these two cultures, Western and African, coming together. It might be an uneasy relationship, but it can be synthesized, to create one whole, a contradictory but beautiful thing, right? But then that turns out it's not true, right? Apartheid happens, colonization happens, and it's brutal. And for the Makerere generation, then they realized that no, we have to have a literature of decolonization or delinking, and as I said earlier, that comes with the contradiction of it's working within the English metaphysical empire. For our generation, the Binyavanga generation at Dichide, well, I guess my generation, our literature is very fractured, right? When you look at the form of, let's say we need new names, we don't have linearity, right? If you look at Helen Habila's, Is It Waiting for an Angel? It's very episodic, and the reason is that things are not as clear as they were when, for example, Frantz Fanon could say, that the colonized and the colonized, or it's a Manishian world, right? It was clear who the enemy was, to put it that way, right? For us, things were not that easy. In Kenya, in the 70s, you couldn't dream of the president's death, right? It was treason. It was considered treasonous to dream of the president's death. Like, how do you write about that in fiction? So you in other words, for our generation, you can't pull a things fall apart kind of book, right? Then for the generation that's younger than us, they're more global, and people are struggling with what to name their literature. Is it Afropolitan? In my book, I argue it's rooted transnational, meaning that it's because for that generation they have a memory, right, of Africa, right, and most of them are in touch with their African roots. But at the same time, they have grown up outside the continent, right? So they're producing a literature that's very different. And what I would argue against is the tendency to sort of want to bracket them, or bring them into African literature. They're producing a different literature that's concerned with different issues. For example, let's say immigration, of attrition, and so on and so forth. But my point, to agree with Likimani, is that War and Peace, we consider it a classic. Nobody says War and Peace. We talk about its aesthetics, right? And it's the most political book. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, right? Again, extremely political. Joseph Conrad, The Secret Agent. So I don't know. All writing is political.
I can't really remember what your question was exactly, Abubakar, because I really got carried away by what he was saying. So.
Ooh, Mukoma. What I asked was this need for African writers, this expectation for African writers to explain Africa, to explain their civilization, their being human in literature.
Okay, first of all, I think a writer is first a writer. A writer does not have to think of any other person's expectations before writing what he or she thinks he should write about. Writing is informed by our experiences, our perceptions, our concerns. I don't think it's even a good idea to start by exploring or thinking about what people think, or what confines, or what are the expectations of people or of critics or of reviewers of my work before I speak of my pen or my laptop to start writing. That is number one. So I think it is essential that we write about what we think we ought to educate people on, issues that concern us. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to align it to some certain historical or epic, or these things come naturally. They come into your writing naturally. Your culture comes in. You can't help it. You can't be writing, you can't be a northerner from northern Nigeria and then you are writing a book and your character is a Chinyere. Or like all your characters, you have to align with your culture. If you pick Ayobami's book, stay with me, you come across Yoruba names. If you pick Chimamanda's, you come across Igbo names. If you pick Abubakar Ibrahim's Season of Crimson Blossoms, you come across Binta and Reza. Those are northern names. So I don't think the first point of contact is actually the history. That comes naturally. It always shows up sometimes, naturally.
So are there no Chinyeres and Chukudis in northern Nigeria?
What I'm saying is, if you look at these books, we have all read our literature, and I'm sure you quite understand what I am talking about. But what I'm saying essentially is our culture, our environment reflects on our writings naturally, without having to think about uh, what people will think, if this is in line with us being human. Of course, we are human. We don't have to answer that question. We all know we are. So that should not even arise.
Going along with that, there are ways in which we have begun to look at African literature by how it portrays us to the West, right? So, and this is where you come up with terms like poverty porn, which is what Helen Habila, who I like, I just reviewed his book, The Chibok Girls. Or Ikede Ikeola. I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm only attacking Nigerians. No, but
it's what the Kenyans would do.
Yeah, yeah. But for me, I'm finding that line of criticism to be very, very dangerous, because what it does is to silence books, right? So the kind of reviews that were done by Africans for We Need New Names were the sort of reviews that were designed to silence that book by dismissing it as portraying Africans as in the lines of poverty porn, as opposed to trying to understand it as a book that's unearthing several contradictions of Zimbabwe post independence, as well as the contradictions of the West. That's one thing. Then the other thing that line of criticism does is to prevent us from reading literature beyond that written by African writers, right? For example, I argue, why can't we think of Heart of Darkness as an African novel, right? Read it along, things fall apart. No, listen, no, exactly. That's my point, right? It doesn't take away it doesn't take away from your Africanness, right? What it does is it allows you to think about the contradictions revealed in Heart of Darkness about the West, right? Heart of Darkness as its heart, pun intended, is a critique of Western imperialism, right? So this is more for literary critics. We cannot choose our literary criticism because the book likes us or it doesn't, right? We pick up books because first they're being read, and then also to understand where they're coming from. So, okay, so if you dismiss Heart of Darkness, you dismiss Enlightenment thinkers as racist, which they were. But if you dismiss them as racist, then what? You're closing also other voices, right? How many of us here talk about William Anton, who was a Ghanaian, the first guy to get a PhD in philosophy in the 1700s in Germany, right? If you dismiss all that, you miss those interesting, historical timing. So if we close those doors, then we're denying ourselves, first, a very rich heritage, and also we are denying ourselves a way of understanding the things that also formed us.
So just riding on that, when you consider works by, for instance, Aminata Foreigner, for instance, right? Her second novel, which is focused on the war in, was it in Bosnia? Yes, and the characters are completely Europeans, and she is African. Would you consider that as African literature, for instance?
Well, I mean, I actually, last semester I was teaching that book in an African literature course, right? Because of the questions it raises, right? Why can't we read it? Because so there's a nice essay I always talk about by Linda Gregg called The Art of Finding, right? Where she talks about where we write from, right? And she argues that there are experiences that we go through, some of them tragic, in our lives, that then become what she calls a vital force, something we draw from, right? So when you read The Hired Man by Aminata Foreigner, you can see really you can see she's talking about her experiences as well in Sierra Leone, right? The theater has shifted; it will bring in new things, right? But really, you can look at that book and start thinking about it in terms of where is she writing from, right? How is this related to the Sierra Leonean War and so on and so forth.
Okay, so riding on what you said and what Safiya just said before she handed over the mic, about the need for an African writer or a writer to kind of reflect his environment. When you write, do you think of yourself as an African writer, or you just write thinking of yourself as just a writer?
Well, I mean, I do consider myself an African writer, right? But I've also been in the U.S. now, since 1990, right? So I've also been formed by the U.S., right? And if you look at most of my novels, For example, Nairobi Heat features an African-American detective, who comes to Kenya and so on and so on. So, yeah, I do consider myself an African writer, but I'm many things, right? An African writer doesn't have to be one thing. I can be an African writer who is many, many things. Right? I was born in the US, grew up in Kenya, right? I cannot discount that. So I would say, if we agree we should let African literature be many things, then also let African literature be many things.
Does that apply to you, Safiya? Do you think you are writing the African story when you write?
Of course, yes. Your settings reflect your environment. If you look at Chimamanda, I refer to Chimamanda again. If you look at Americana, for instance, some of the settings in that book are in the US. That is because she is in the US. If you look at Leslie Neka Arima's short stories, most of the settings are in the US or a transit between US and Nigeria. That is because these are environments she is familiar with. These are environments where she lives. So, of course, but essentially, she is African. It doesn't really matter where the setting is. But if you look at the characters reflect the cultural origin, irrespective of the setting.
Africa is a continent somewhere in the world with the shape. In the Ghanaian constitution, you are a Ghanaian if you are born of a Ghanaian. That is all. Why must we? I don't understand.
Exactly. That's
Because, when you say, I'm sitting here listening to Mukoma expand, and you could have added Pushkin to the list.
Okay, yeah.
And why? Sometimes I feel like we want to narrow something where we are this vast people, and what does it matter? What is an African story? Why are we asking ourselves such questions? I sometimes want to be Japanese and wonder why are they asking themselves what is an African question. And I worry every time we do this that we must be careful to expand and free people to write. And every time we do these things, I feel like there's a writer somewhere, a young writer, an old writer, an emerging writer who is feeling like, well, I can't do this because this is so vast. When all really I'm just saying, maybe look out of your house on your road, just consider that road and make something out of what is happening on that road. But if we continue to do this, Africa is a big thing, and we must just stop. I feel like we must stop. Because and then we are narrowing when I think about the books that of the past 20 or so years since since this millennium 18 and all the love. I remember tweeting that Uncle Ngugi's Wizard of the Crow was the best book of the century. This was like somewhere, I think 20, and I don't know. And Kigoro, a Kenyan on Twitter, said, I must be careful not to say that because the millennium is quite early. Which is true because since then, well, Wizard of the Crow, my current favorite, queen of all the queens and the kings, Jennifer Makumi and Chintu, Njabulo Ndebele's The Cry of Winnie Mandela, the short stories, Igoni Barrett, Doreen, and what's his name? Alan Mabonko, Agualusa in, what is that book, that one, The Impact? Something of the Oblivion, right?
Yeah, a general theory of
Please read that book. And Dust from Kenya and detective fiction and all that we are doing with this so-called Afrofuturism. Instead of worrying so much about what is an African story, which I think silences a lot of people, we should, in fact, the question is, how are we going to get more of these wonderful things? Because there's so much, I don't understand, there's so much different writing. Am I the only one who is seeing it? No. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and to add to that, there are real world consequences of that, right? In terms of how we look at African literature. For example, With European literature, we talk about Enlightenment literature or Restoration literature. We talk about Romanticism. Within Romanticism, you have different streams, and so, for example, in my department, you have maybe 9 or 10, professors who are looking at one historical period because they have allowed it to be many things, right? Whereas for me, I'm seen as the African lead guy. Like anything about African literature, go as the African lead guy, right? Because I'm expected to be an expert of all of African literature. Whereas it's really silly that it's impossible right now to say, that I teach African literature. You'd have to say, I'm interested in transnational literature and so on and so forth. So we also need to think about how we are periodizing African literature, and then also, at least in the West, have English departments and Afro-American departments and so on and so forth. Also hire multiple people in that field.
I want to say that, the West just wants to limit us, and we must not internalize. I have no interest in engagement with the West at this point in my life. I have no interest in how they see me personally. I think that's why I took to Chintu so much, because it wasn't there. But I think that when we are far ahead, we must believe that when they want to engage with us, they bring us back down. And we allow them to do so when they tokenize, and they are always treating African literature as emerging. And we must stop that. So let's not have, do you see what I'm saying, people? It's a vast thing. We must be the most, in fact, we are vast. We dwarf people everywhere. Now, if we take the way where Mukoma is going, I hadn't thought of Aminata Fornes, the hired man as African literature. See, now, look at where he's taking us now, the things we can claim legitimately. Do you see what I'm saying? And so when they come back to, well, African literature, and you are emerging, and what is African literature? How do you define what is African literature? It's so big. Just read a book.
And when you read non-African literature, for instance, American literature, right? Do you go with the expectation that, okay, I'm here, explain to me this police killing of African Americans?
Right. I would say that, okay, so I like to joke and say I believe African literary critics in particular should be in jail. Right, I'm not playing around. If I was a dictator, I would have them in jail. Okay, okay. Of course, I'm joking, right? No, half joking. But but I say that because what's the work of the literary critic? Okay, writers themselves, want to believe they're the first people to write, and so in fact it's them, each generation comes and says, they want to kill, or whatever, or they're working against or defend themselves against the previous generation. So it's the job of the African literary critic, to read how those literatures are connected. Do I think of myself as, yeah? So there are two things, right? You could argue about what the novel itself, the intrinsic qualities of the novel itself. What is the novel doing? Or you could argue about the extrinsic qualities of the novel, and that would be reception. That would be how literary critics are reading the book. So I would say first we need to separate the two, right? A novel is a novel. It does what it does, right? And then there's the question of what the literary critic does, or in my argument, what the literary critic is not doing. Yeah, but I think as writers, we shouldn't be concerned about image. I think that's the last thing we should be concerned about. And I have to say, I've become so worried about that argument of some writers are writing for the West. Fuck it, they're in the West. What are they gonna write, right? And I'm seeing more and more division between African writers based in Africa and African writers or by any other names who are based in the West. And there's this argument, that the African writers in the West are sort of privileged. The African writers here are struggling. Everybody's struggling, right? And I'm not saying that in a anyway, yeah.
It would be nice that an African book, a book from an African anywhere in the world, is written and it is received just as that, a story. The West likes to not remove that freedom from African writing and African books. So Again, if I read a book from Eastern Europe, I'm not going to say, well, you didn't cover this and you didn't cover that, you didn't cover that. But they do it to African. So it's very hard. I'm sorry, but I think that African writers have to be mindful of who is critiquing our work and which critiques you take seriously and which you just say, well, fuck it, bye. It's very important because how are you going to, you see, you are not going to please people who, even in 2018, dehumanize us, reduce us to some issues they think, who really don't know anything about us, and most importantly, are not interested in knowing anything about us, but yet want to read our books and become experts. You know, the West has experts on Africa. It's mind-boggling. So I think it's very important if there's one thing I would prescribe for African writers is that you have to be mindful of where some of these critiques are coming from, the environment your book is being received in, and it's unfair. But that's why we want more freedom in the world, so that we are free. But no, you are not here to meet anybody's expectation of what Africa is.
Okay, can I add something as well?
Yeah.
You know, and also we have other real problems, right? Consider we are, what, 54 countries, a population of almost 1 billion, right? Yet how many literary journals can you count?
Yes.
Right? Let's say about 10 or so, right? For that, I mean, it's crazy, right? When you start thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
How many literary prizes can you count, right? How many literary agents do we have? Zero, right? So in other words, we have real issues of structure, right? We have real issues of something that will bridge. Let's say a kid wants to be a writer. How will that kid realize, you know, that dream if there is no, you know, like kid little journals, you know? Let me put it this way. Let's say in the state of New York, there are more prizes, more literary journals than in the whole continent, right? So there are those real issues that we also need to attend to.
When you have this kind of expectations from even African critics, you know, what is the African writer supposed to do?
Right. I think that I would say that the situation where critics and academics largely privilege the older generation or the folk over what is happening now is a travesty. So you find that a lot of older critics, professors are not reading younger or even newer books. That's their problem, not yours. One day when they wake up, the books will be there. Again, all of this is not for a freeing environment for African writers, but the only thing we can say is that you should just write and we hope the channels open up and people actually receive each book while being part of a community of books and a continuum, each book on its own merits.
It's really a huge problem that our scholars here in Nigeria don't want to think beyond post-colonial literature. They don't want to think beyond the Achebes and the Wole Soyinkas. But we have evolved. We have a new voice. We have new literatures, new very interesting literatures. And it's so disheartening when you go to a university and you realize that all they teach are books that were published in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. That is all they teach. They don't really care about these new books because they think they are not canonized. They don't conform to what they have been taught. And that is because they are not ready to sit down, read these books, critique them, analyze them, and teach the students. And it's really killing the literature classes that we have in universities. I remember when I did my master's degree, I was almost halfway through. I was working on Ni Oshundare, and then I stumbled across some books I had never seen before. One author with 8 novels, and I was intrigued. So I went back to my supervisor and told him, look, I want to change my topic. I have seen a new author and I want to work on his books. And he was like, well, if you can read all these books in 1 month and give me a summary. I did, and I came back, and he was impressed. So we went ahead, and I did that work. So on the day of my external defense, the external examiner came from another university. The first question she asked me was, how am I sure all these books are novels? That was the first thing she asked me. And some of those books were published as early as 2001. And they are very good literature. Some have even won awards. One of them has won the Anna Jacaranda Award. So I was perplexed. I was speechless. If a professor of literature does not know, has never heard of an African writer, a professor himself, the writer, who has written 8 novels, then I think we really have a huge problem.
Yeah, and to add to that, so Ned Nkorofa was telling me the story about how she went and presented at in front of African literary critics, and some of them started telling her that she's not producing African literature, because it's sci-fi or Afrofuturism, right? But at the heart of that sort of reception is that we have inherited the same anxieties that European critics have, right? We have just accepted their divide, right? So we have accepted, what is literary and what is not, along the same lines, So that's something we need to think about. But I wanted to give you, in terms of the question of reception, the example of Amos Totiola, right? So Amos Totiola, as you all know, wrote The Palm White Drinkard, right? And it was written in what we would call, a quote-unquote broken English, right? Because he had up to standard 7 education. So what was interesting about that was how he was received, right? The Western literary critics were like, yeah, this is great. Here's an example of the primitive mind. If you want to catch man at the beginning, of thinking, this is what you want to read, right? And then the African literary critics were so mortified, right? They're, so mortified because, as others have argued, because they felt, to my mind, shame, right? Because they're grown up being taught that all literature exists in standard English, right? So they ended up dismissing the book. And if you look at the early, at the early criticism, instead of asking some of the questions they should have been asking, which is, one, why didn't he write in Yoruba to begin with, right? And and why, why didn't he write in Yoruba to begin with? Or even questions of form, right? And to be fair, later literary critics did deal with that, right? But questions of form and so on and so forth.
Okay, so I'm just going to throw it open to the audience for questions. And I see Dr. Abubakar Othman has his hands up. Professor Asabe is over there too. And there's a lady here at the front, 3. Okay. Okay, Dr. Giwa and Professor E.E. Sule. I'm being very biased here. Because they are academics, so they have things to contribute to this conversation. So, I mean, we've been bashing them all morning, right? So I think it's fair to just give them a response.
Ladies and gentlemen, your moderator.
Are we there now thinking, globally as African writers? Now that is when we write, are we conscious of our own global audience or our own local audience? Now that our problems have also become global, because African problem is not a global problem, right? Do we now discuss our own African or Nigerian problem outside the context, of the global perception of these problems? One. Secondly, what do you say about the brilliant argument put forward by Chimamanda Adichie about the single story dilemma, right? What do you say about that? The single story here, by our own explanation, is that they already have a template, right? A picture in their mind what the African is and what is expected of the African writer, right? Do we still pursue that? Because they judge you based on that single story, which is a silly thing.
Panelist, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, but there's a generational shift in how people, how writers are treating sex, right? For the Makerere generation and the earlier generation, the South African, the literature of synthesis, sex always happened off the page, right? Or it would be quoted in, and then the bees sang whatever, right? But I think the younger generations, to put it bluntly, are allowing their characters to fuck on the page, right? So there is that generational shift, right? in terms of globalization, there's a line I like from Kwame Anthony Appiah on cosmopolitanism, and we can talk about the contradictions of cosmopolitanism. But he has a great line where he's talking about his father, and his father says, "What is the point of having roots if you cannot carry them with you?" Right? So and to me, that also recalls the struggles that people like Tai Selassie have gone through in terms of trying to define themselves and their generation. Now, Afropolitanism has its issues, but it's an attempt to try to name people who are rooted in multiple ways. And really, also, we need to break from always thinking about Africa and the West, right? What are the ways in which, if I move from Kenya to Tanzania, haven't I traveled abroad? You know what I mean? Or if we think about, about the ways we are creolized, right? We always think in terms of white and black, right? But for example, me as a Kikuyu, I also have, Maasai blood and so on and so forth. So I think most fundamentally, we need a break from always thinking about Africa and the West. To give you a quick example, right? Okay, Malcolm X, for example, came to Kenya. From Kenya, he went to Ghana. And the Kenyans, I didn't know this until a few years ago, that he came and even addressed the Kenyan parliament, right? So if I take an example of Cuba. Cuba goes to the, Che Guevara first goes to the Congo, fights there. The Cubans also go to Angola, where, as Mandela said, they help break apartheid's back, right? So again, if you're only concerned with Africa and the West, then you're missing these other histories, or South-to-South relationships.
I want to say that in fact, I even hate the word global. I hate global. I think global is where African things go and die. And especially when we talk about, again, reiterating your point where global is only the West. It must be some kind of a Stockholm syndrome that we are always talking about globalization. When I come to read my books, I do not consider what the West is going to think about anything that I'm reading. In fact, it is a freedom thing that I do. I don't know. I think that we should be far more concerned about what we think about each other. We should be far more concerned about how we are going to talk each other into the spaces and the will to do and change our continent than global. Because I don't know, global is done to us. We don't do global. Do we understand that global is done to us? And that's what did James Baldwin say? The bad luck, a black person's bad luck was meeting a white person. We must be very circumspect about this going global thing. Because I don't see that it has benefited us any. We must, like he's saying, there are all sorts of relationships and all sorts of relations and conversations we must be having without this whole thing about going global. I don't care. Does it matter? We just want good stories where we can pick up the story, you read the story, and for the hour or 2 days or 1 week you read that story, it made you feel good, it made you think, and maybe if you are looking for that, sometimes I do, maybe it explained a little bit of something you were wondering about your own people. But I mean, if we are then to superimpose what the global world now, why would we do that? You know what I learned one day that blew my mind? I read a lot of Indian literature. But then I found out that people like Rohinton Mystery, the Indian writers that are writing in English, are not as popular as the Indian writers writing in their own language. So here I was engaging in some kind of global discourse, but it was highly truncated because the Indians are having their own conversations with themselves in their language. And I'm like, I know India, but actually I don't. But that literature they are that discourse they are having amongst themselves is what I want translated, because that's what I want to have access to. So why are we always concerned about West?
Just to put things in perspective, I think the highest selling Indian author has never been published in the West. Yes. He's published in India and he's read by Indians. But here we can't have a conversation with Kenya, for instance, without the intermediary or the interception of the West. Your books have to go through London before they come through Kenya, which is ridiculous. Things are shifting gradually now, with Cassava Republic and other publishers, kind of finding channels to exchange books. But I think we have issues. Yeah, and it's clear Kinna hates a lot of things, so be careful. Yes.
Okay. Hi. So my name is Sarah, and my question is about the phrase African literature. So we review books. I'm based in the UK and review books on our podcast. So we're Africans, and that's our point of entry. But we recognize that the phrase African literature itself, it's othering. So by using that phrase, we recognize that it's othering us, othering the books that we're talking about. And also, some people just shot to their mind automatically, thinking that, well, they would close their mind, thinking that this book is not for me. As such, we've been it is now apparent that there needs to be a new way of talking about books by people of African descent. But there needs to be an umbrella. But the existing umbrella does not work for us. So have you thought about it? Are you aware of any conversations taking place and any suggested terms that is more inclusive but not so constricting and not so Western?
So like I was saying, people like Tai Selassie have struggled through that, like with terms like Afropolitanism. With myself here, I struggled through the term of rooted transnationalism, right? To mean people who are aware of many cultures, of who are living through many cultures, right? And there are ways in which to go, but yes, then, okay, I'm losing my point. I would say, okay, when we say African writer, if I say I'm an African myself, I don't mean Africa is a continent, right? I say I'm an African aware of the many, many differences. So for me, the word African writer contains multitudes, if you will, right? It's only when we're talking to the West that becomes an issue. So, and I find that very interesting. Why can't we just say African writer and understand within it that it means many, many things? In the same way when you say European literature, that question doesn't arise, right? We always assume it's many, many things. So it's an interesting term for me, where for us it means many, many things, but in the West then it becomes a question of reception and how it's seen.
Okay.
I don't have a category. Again, I think it's the way. I understand the problem you are talking about, but I think it's also the way in which the category African literature is received. So the problem is not the phrase or the conception, the conceptualization. The problem is the reception and the environment. You see what I'm saying? So I feel like somehow you're asking that, can we change something we are doing or categorizing to fit an unreceptive environment?
I'm Asabe Kabir Usman, a professor of oral and African literatures from Usman Danfodio University, Sokoto. I only got to know about this program yesterday, and I tried to come in today, even if it's for 2 hours. Why African literature matters or matter. African literature, and most examples we get are African literatures written in the English language. Where do you place African literatures written in the indigenous languages, which are many, and they deserve criticism, they deserve attention, and they deserve recognition. Thank you very much.
Okay, my name is Isuli. My own question is, when we are talking about the African writing, and of course in European languages, when we talk about thematic issues, receptions, but do we look at the production level? If you're writing a novel and you want it published, we all want to be published in the West. What are the editorial processes you go through? Do they have a way of constricting what you want to say? Do they have a way of defining your view? These are also very crucial.
Who wants to take that?
I can't
So my argument has always been we need to decolonize African literary criticism, right? Because while we have talked about the novel as decolonizing, right? Look at some of the terms we use when you're talking about African literature. Even look at some of the terms I've used. I've used cosmopolitan, rooted transnationalism, in fact, post-colonial, the whole enterprise, right? Hybridity and so on and so forth is using Western concepts to look at African literature, right? But why can't we use our own concepts? For example, Abiku, right? Why can't we use Abiku, the concept of constant return, to talk about Toni Morrison's Beloved, for example, right? And when I say that at some conference in the West, people laughed, and I was like, yeah, you see, that's exactly what I mean, right? So we need to decolonize African literary criticism in terms conceptually, and also we need African literary criticism to exist in African languages, right? Yeah, decolonize African literary criticism. That's my new slogan.
Okay.
There's a question the professor had.
Is there a question?
Yes.
Yeah, Safiya?
About the language question, I think there has really been an issue since the emergence of African literature. I know that Ngugi has tried to...
Which of the Ngugis?
Yeah, which one?
The elder.
Ngugi wa Thiong'o has the older Ngugi, yes, has tried to argue that it is better to write in indigenous languages because he feels, why should we be writing in a foreign language, the same language that we are trying to alienate ourselves from, the same language, the owners of the language we are saying have tried to colonize us, have colonized us. So now, why should we then take what belongs to them in expressing ourselves? So he wrote in Gikuyu language instead of the English language. But the problem we have in Africa as a continent is that we have diverse languages. We don't have a universal language that everyone understands, like the foreign languages. You can't write in Hausa and expect the Kenyans or the Ghanaians to read that. The only medium of from so I think this problem of translation is really huge. They tried to address it, and Achebe came up with the idea that, okay, why don't we just use the English, but let's bend it to suit our African sensibilities. And that is why we bring the aspects of oral literatures, like the proverbs and the folk tales, which you don't really find in works from anywhere that is not African. But we still have this problem because our indigenous literatures are growing. We have Hausa writings that are coming up, we have Kikuyu writings, we have writings from other parts of Africa that are coming up. And the thing is, we just need this translation, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. Can I say something quickly? Because something that has been bothering me and something that I do as well, and that's how we talk about African languages, right? Okay, first look at the acrobatics we have to do. We are seeing the default when we say African literature, we mean African literature in European languages. That's the default, right? So then you have to do the acrobatics of saying African literature in African languages, right? so that's one. The other one is how we talk about the African languages themselves. They're either tribal, local, indigenous, and so on and so forth, right? And when you look at those terms, in the Oxford English Dictionary, actually they within themselves, I was having a discussion on Facebook the other day and argued that within their DNA, they have negative connotations. Indigenous means the way we understand it now, but it also has connotations of slaves.
Yes.
And ethnic has connotations anyway, so they have very negative connotation. Why can't we, instead of having to always qualify African languages, why can't we just say African languages?
Exactly. For me, the irony is that when you mention Ngugi, he writes in Gikuyu, then translates it into English, and that is the one that people access. And you as a full day person, for instance, if you write in full day, who is going to publish your book?
But can I say something quickly, right? Okay, so my Mrs. Shaw, has sold like 200 copies, right? You know what I mean? It's in English, it has sold 200 copies, right? If I had written in the Equatorial and sold 200 copies, why should the 200 copies I sell in the West be more important than the 200 copies I sell to the Equatorial, into the Equatorial people?
So I think that the fact that we have a lot of languages, multitudes, is not a problem. That's a colonial framing of a people. So our languages are not the problem. It's the problem. The real problem is the infrastructure around making our works accessible in all languages. That is the real problem, and the problem even exists in the European languages we write in. When you think about, I can walk into a bookstore and get any book written by written in French by Ghana is surrounded our immediate neighbors. Ghanaians and Nigerians, we act like we are neighbors, but there are like countries between us. And that is because it is from one European language to another. We are inaccessible to each other. So the issue is that we have not, and this, when you talk about decolonization, people roll their eyes and it falls into their stomach. If we don't do that, then we will continue to frame our own languages as inaccessible, as the problem. My mother and I, we have they call it's because it's let's say a Nancy storytelling group, right? And when they perform, multitudes of people come. But if you have a book reading in English, maybe you have 50 people. So then we really, if we invest in the infrastructure, if we face up to the fact that, and we diss that whole thing about globalization, our artists can only make more money because you will have the attention. What do artists want? Earballs, ears, eyes, and minds. But in fact, the way we do now is unsustainable. It's the other way that can, I even hate the word sustainable, but it's okay. So the issue is the infrastructure around the languages. There are people who are selling more books in Hausa than our so-called writers in English. And that should give us real hope, and that should point in the direction we should be going. Because do we want to read our own books? What kind of conversations do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it is not the problem. Languages are just amazing.
Yeah.
But it is just that we are colonized, we haven't decolonized, and we refuse. Somehow we think, and somehow we also think that we must have universal languages. This is a very colonial concept. Mm-hmm. We don't have to have universal languages. We can have languages that are translated.
She's not going to stop.
Can I add something quickly? Just very, very quickly.
Just briefly.
Yeah, so take Things Fall Apart, for example, right? Things Fall Apart has been translated into over 50, some people say 75 languages, right? How many of them are African, right? Is there even an Igbo translation of Things Fall Apart, right? And the fact that this famous book that has sold millions doesn't exist in the author's language, that should give us pause, right? But I think our ambition should be to have, let's say, Things Fall Apart in every African language. Why not?
It's been an honor to trash out this issue with this distinguished panelists who have come to the conclusion that African literature or literatures matter.